They told you this was just another Middle East skirmish. They were wrong. 2,000 operations in 45 days, tanks on fire, drones falling from the sky like rain, and an army that calls itself the most powerful force in the Middle East, grinding to a halt in the hills of South Lebanon. Not because they ran out of ammunition, not because they lacked the will to fight, but because they walked into something they had never truly prepared for, and by the time they understood what they were facing, the cost had already become almost unbearable. I want you to stay with me for the next few minutes because what I'm going to tell you is not the version you heard on the evening news. It's not the clean, sanitized, politically convenient summary. It's the full picture, the real numbers, the tactics that stunned Western intelligence analysts, the behind-closed-doors decisions that shaped this war, and the question at the end of all of it that nobody in power seems willing to answer honestly. Because here is the thing about this conflict that most coverage gets completely wrong. The story of what happened between Israel and Hezbollah in South Lebanon is not primarily a story about rockets and drones and military hardware, although all of that matters enormously and we are going to get deep into it. It is a story about strategy, about patience, about decades of preparation meeting decades of assumptions, and about what happens when a military superpower discovers in real time, under fire, that the battlefield it expected to fight on no longer exists. So let's start where the real story starts, not in October of last year, not in the weeks leading up to the ground operation. Let's start years earlier in the hills and tunnels beneath South Lebanon, where Hezbollah was doing something that almost nobody in the Western press was paying adequate attention to. After the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah, something fundamental shifted inside Hezbollah's military command. The 2006 war had been painful for both sides, but Hezbollah drew a set of lessons from it that were brutally honest and operationally specific. They looked at what had worked and what had failed. They studied how the IDF fought. They mapped Israel's tactical patterns, its reliance on armor, its dependence on air superiority, its preference for rapid, decisive operations that minimize Israeli casualties, and then they spent the next 18 years building a response to every single one of those advantages. This is the detail that changes your entire understanding of what happened in 2024. Hezbollah did not improvise. Hezbollah did not react. Hezbollah waited. With extraordinary discipline and strategic patience, they constructed an underground infrastructure in South Lebanon that would make professional military planners genuinely uncomfortable to look at. Deep tunnel networks that satellite imagery could not fully penetrate. Weapons caches pre-positioned across dozens of locations so that destroying any single supply line would not collapse the system. Command and control networks deliberately decentralized, meaning that taking out a commander, even a senior one, would not paralyze operations below. Every node could function independently. Every unit had its orders. The machine was designed to keep running even when pieces of it were being destroyed. And on top of that physical infrastructure, Hezbollah had spent years integrating something that would prove to be one of the most tactically significant elements of the entire conflict: drone technology. Not the large, expensive, radar-visible drones you see in conventional military inventories, something far more difficult to defend against. Small, fast, cheap FPV drones, first-person view drones operated by a single fighter using a headset and a controller, capable of being guided with surgical precision into the weak points of armored vehicles, capable of being produced at a fraction of the cost of the weapons systems they were destroying. When the IDF entered South Lebanon, they were prepared for a Hezbollah that had existed in 2006. What they encountered was something 18 years more sophisticated, more capable, and more dangerous, and the opening days of the ground operation made that gap devastatingly clear. The terrain itself was a weapon. South Lebanon is not the open desert where Israeli armor and air power create overwhelming advantages. It is mountains, valleys, narrow village streets, elevation changes that make every advance a potential ambush. Hezbollah had spent years turning that terrain into a fortress. Buildings converted into fighting positions over the course of years, not weeks. Elevated sniper locations with overlapping fields of fire, underground routes connecting positions so that fighters could move without ever appearing above ground. In the town of Bent Jabil, which became one of the defining engagements of the conflict, Israeli ground forces, attempting to advance, encountered exactly this architecture of defense. Every meter of progress came at a cost. Israeli armor, including the Merkava tank, which is not just Israel's primary battle tank, but a symbol of Israeli national identity, a machine built specifically to protect its crew, a tank whose very name means chariot in Hebrew, was being targeted with an effectiveness that shocked IDF commanders and sent shockwaves through Israeli military and political circles simultaneously. Let me give you the number that defines the scale of what happened. In just 45 days of intense fighting, Hezbollah conducted over 2,184 documented operations using rockets, drones, and direct engagement. That is more than 48 operations every single day. Not occasional attacks, not sporadic harassment, A relentless, sustained, coordinated campaign of pressure that gave Israeli forces virtually no operational rest, no safe rear areas, no predictable rhythm to plan against. When you force your enemy into reactive mode, when they are always responding to your actions rather than dictating the tempo of the battle themselves, that is a strategic advantage that multiplies across every dimension of the conflict. It creates physical exhaustion, it creates psychological strain, it degrades decision-making, it forces commanders to allocate attention to 10 problems simultaneously when their doctrine was built around concentrating force on one. And the toll on Israeli hardware began to accumulate. Hezbollah's documented claims, and I want to be clear that battlefield claims from any party always require scrutiny, reported approximately 188 Israeli tanks and armored vehicles targeted during this period. Dozens of military vehicles, bulldozers, engineering equipment, drones. Israel has not officially confirmed these specific figures, and that is exactly what you would expect from any military managing a difficult operational narrative at home. But independent analysts, journalists on the ground, and satellite imagery assessments all pointed toward a consistent conclusion. The IDF sustained equipment losses in South Lebanon that were significant enough to become a major factor in the eventual ceasefire calculation. The FPV drone attacks deserve particular attention because they represent something genuinely new in the history of asymmetric warfare. In documented footage from the area of Al-Bayada, an FPV drone can be seen striking an Israeli armored vehicle with precision that would have been impossible without years of training and tactical refinement. In areas where Israeli artillery had set up new firing positions, Hezbollah deployed loitering munitions, what the military calls kamikaze drones, to locate and destroy those positions before IDF artillery crews even had time to relocate. This is not a lucky shot. This is a systematic, practiced approach to neutralizing one of Israel's core tactical advantages. And then there were the attacks on Israeli command and communication vehicles. This detail is critical, and it is underreported in most mainstream coverage. When you destroy an enemy's command vehicle, you're not just destroying a piece of hardware. You are degrading their ability to think collectively on the battlefield. You are severing the nervous system connections that turn a collection of individual soldiers into a coordinated fighting force. You are forcing commanders to make life and death decisions with incomplete, corrupted, or absent information. That is psychological warfare layered on top of physical destruction, and it compounds the damage far beyond what the raw equipment losses suggest. Now I need to bring Iran into this picture properly because Iran's role in this conflict is one of those subjects where the mainstream framing consistently misses the most important layer of reality. The easy framing is Iran as puppet master and Hezbollah as puppet. That framing is wrong in a way that matters strategically. The accurate picture is more interesting and more alarming. Iran's investment in Hezbollah over the preceding decades was not about creating a tool for immediate use. It was about building what Iranian strategic planners call the axis of resistance. A layered network of allied forces and proxy groups stretching from Lebanon through Syria and Iraq to Yemen, each with its own local roots and local legitimacy, but collectively creating a regional deterrent architecture that makes any military adventure in the Middle East extraordinarily expensive for whoever initiates it. The Kornet anti-tank missiles that proved devastatingly effective against Israeli armor in South Lebanon did not appear from nowhere. The precision-guided rockets, the drone technology, the training and doctrine that turned Hezbollah fighters into operators capable of executing coordinated multi-domain attacks, all of it reflects years of systematic Iranian military investment and expertise transfer through the Revolutionary Guard Corps. But here's the insight that most Western analysts are uncomfortable stating directly. Iran's actual objective in this conflict was never military victory over Israel. Iran is not suicidal. Iranian strategic planners understand perfectly well that a direct military confrontation with Israel, a nuclear-armed state with an ironclad military alliance with the United States, would be catastrophic for Iran. Iran's strategy was something far more subtle and far more sustainable. Bleed Israel. Make every military operation in the region expensive enough that the Israeli public begins to question whether the cost is worth the objective. Demonstrate to the broader Arab and Muslim world that Israel is not invincible, that the tanks can burn, that the drones can hit, that the superpower can be slowed, bled, and humiliated. And do all of this without triggering a direct confrontation that Iran cannot survive. That strategy in South Lebanon in 2024 worked. Not perfectly, not without enormous cost to Hezbollah, but it worked well enough that the outcome of the conflict reinforced rather than undermined the credibility of Iran's regional deterrent architecture. And then came the ceasefire, and the circumstances surrounding it tell you everything you need to know about how the battlefield calculus had shifted. Donald Trump, the President of the United States, Israel's most powerful ally and largest military benefactor, announced a ceasefire and made clear that Israel was prohibited from continuing its attacks into Lebanon. Let that land for a moment. the leader of the country that provides Israel with billions of dollars in annual military assistance, that gives Israel diplomatic cover in the United Nations Security Council, that has positioned itself as Israel's unconditional ally, stepped in and told Israel to stop. That does not happen when things are going according to plan. That happens when the arithmetic of continuing has become politically unsustainable. Netanyahu's public acknowledgement during this period was extraordinary by the standards of his entire political career. He admitted that Israel had failed to suppress Hezbollah's power and influence in Lebanon. For a man who has survived in Israeli politics for decades by projecting absolute toughness and security competence, by being the indispensable protector, this was not a minor concession. It was a crack in the foundation of his political identity, and the domestic political consequences were immediate and significant. And yet, even as the ceasefire was announced, the violations began almost immediately. Israeli drone strikes were reported in Lebanese territory. Attacks on ambulances were documented by Lebanese health authorities. A UNIFIL peacekeeper from France was killed in circumstances that generated immediate international condemnation. Israel's defense minister made clear that the IDF intended to maintain its positions in occupied areas of Lebanese territory and was already preparing operational plans for what would come after the ceasefire period ended. This is what a ceasefire looks like when neither party has actually achieved what it came to achieve. It is not peace, it is an operational pause, a moment to count losses, resupply ammunition, reposition forces, and draw lessons from what just happened. Military strategists have a specific term for it, and what both sides do during that pause determines everything about what follows. What makes the human cost of this conflict so morally staggering is not just the scale, but the specific nature of what was documented. The United Nations Peacekeeping Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, which has been present in South Lebanon continuously since 1978, came under fire repeatedly throughout the conflict. 3 soldiers from Indonesia's Garuda Battalion were killed when their position was struck. Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim-majority democracy, a country of 280 million people, and the killing of its soldiers serving under a UN mandate generated a diplomatic response that added a new layer of international pressure on Israel at precisely the moment when that pressure was already building from multiple directions. The International Committee of the Red Cross documented the deaths of at least 57 medical workers during the conflict. Paramedics, doctors, nurses, people who under every framework of international humanitarian law are specifically and absolutely protected from attack, 57 of them. The Latani River Bridge, a critical crossing that serves as a genuine lifeline for communities throughout South Lebanon, was destroyed. Villages across the south were left in rubble. And then, before the dust had settled, before the infrastructure had been repaired, before the bridges had been rebuilt, the residents began coming back, crossing the river on whatever routes remained, walking through destroyed streets to find whatever was left of their homes, hundreds of thousands of people returning to rubble because it was their rubble and they were not going to be permanently displaced. This image, these hundreds of thousands of people returning, is not just a humanitarian story. It is a strategic signal of profound importance. Hezbollah's legitimacy, its local legitimacy, the kind that cannot be manufactured from Tehran or anywhere else, comes from being embedded in that community. When the community comes back, Hezbollah's roots come back with them. A military campaign that destroys infrastructure but cannot break the will of the population it targets does not weaken the armed movement that draws its strength from that population, it strengthens it. Zoom out to the widest possible frame now, because what happened in South Lebanon is not a standalone story. It is a chapter in a much larger restructuring of power across the entire Middle East. The United States, which has been the dominant external power in the region since the end of the Cold War, is navigating a moment of genuine strategic friction. American support for Israel is generating costs with Arab partner states that Washington needs for its own regional objectives. It is generating friction with European allies who are growing increasingly vocal about international humanitarian law and increasingly willing to act on that concern. And it is generating tension within American domestic politics, where younger generations hold significantly more complicated views about unconditional Israeli military support than previous generations did. Russia is watching from its military presence in Syria with intense interest, drawing the conclusion that American military dominance in the region is far more contested than the official narrative suggests. China is the silent observer with the longest time horizon of all, tracking the implications for shipping lanes, energy flows, and the broader question of whether the current American-led regional order is as stable as it appears on the surface. And so we arrive at where we are now, a ceasefire that was already fraying from the moment it was announced. A battlefield that is quiet on the surface and anything but quiet underneath. A Hezbollah that sustained real losses but emerged from the conflict organizationally intact, militarily credible, and in possession of an enormous volume of tactical intelligence about how the IDF fights and where its vulnerabilities lie. an Israeli military reassessing its doctrine, its equipment, its approach to this specific type of adversary in this specific terrain, an Iranian strategic command studying the results and adjusting what comes next. The 10-day ceasefire. The phrase itself tells you something about the gap between the diplomatic language being used and the underlying reality being managed. 10 days as if decades of unresolved conflict, billions of dollars of weapons and infrastructure, thousands of lives and competing existential narratives can be suspended and resolved in 10 days. What the ceasefire actually represents is exhaustion, a moment where the immediate costs of continued fighting exceeded the immediate benefits for both sides. That is not peace, that is arithmetic. And arithmetic changes the moment the numbers change. The tunnels that the IDF could never fully map are still there. The rocket stockpiles that were not fired during the ceasefire are still there. The drone operators, the missile crews, the command networks built to survive decapitation still there. And in the secure rooms of Tel Aviv and Tehran and Washington and somewhere in the mountains of South Lebanon, people are right now looking at satellite imagery, running calculations, drawing lessons from 45 days of the most intense sustained combat seen in that region in years. The real question, the one that determines whether what comes next is worse than what just happened, is not a military question. It is a political one. Does anyone in this entire situation have a genuine plan for the day after? For what comes after the fighting stops for good? For how Lebanon actually exercises sovereignty over its own territory? For how Hezbollah's disarmament, which has been demanded in UN Security Council resolutions since 2006, actually happens? For how the Palestinian question, which casts a shadow over every single element of this conflict, is addressed? The honest answer, based on everything observable, is no. Nobody has a credible plan for the day after. The United States has diplomatic frameworks but no enforcement mechanism. The United Nations has resolutions that have been violated consistently for nearly 2 decades by multiple parties. The European Union has statements and sanctions threats, but is internally divided and externally limited, and the parties themselves are pursuing objectives that are fundamentally incompatible with each other. The hills of South Lebanon are quiet right now, but quiet in the Middle East has never meant peace. It has always meant preparation. The story you just heard is not the end. It is the end of one chapter. And the next chapter is being written right now, in real time, by people who have all studied what happened in those 45 days and drawn very different conclusions about what it means for what they do next. The only question that actually matters is whether anyone, anywhere in this equation, has the wisdom and the political courage to imagine an ending different from the one the current trajectory is pointing toward. Because if they don't, the next time we have this conversation, the numbers will be larger, the destruction will be deeper, and the people crossing the Latani River to go home to rubble will be doing it all over again.